My name is Desta Horner from the Oviedo Historical Society, and I'm here with Ben Wheeler, whose family have been residents of Oviedo for many generations. We're going to talk about the history of Oviedo. This interview is being conducted at the University of Central Florida in collaboration with the Riches Program. Ben, Wheelers have been around a long time. Tell me something about you and your family.
Well, my earliest ancestor to come here was a Civil War widow named Narcissa Melissa Lawton. She had several children, one of which married my great-grandfather, John Thomas Wheeler. They moved to Dade City, and he had a stroke. He was a sawmill man, and he had a stroke and died. So R.W. Lawton, who would have been Narcissa's brother, sent one of the Allens, I think it was Theodore, to Dade City with a two-wheel ox cart and loaded them up, whatever little bit they had, which probably wasn't much, and brought them back to Oviedo.
Who married Wheeler in order to get the Wheeler in your name? One of the Lawtons married a Wheeler?
Yes. Clara Isabel Lawton married John Thomas. She wasn't a widow. Narcissa was a widow. And this was her daughter.
So she married a Wheeler.
Yes.
And that was Ben Wheeler the first, the Ben Wheeler?
His name was Benjamin Franklin Wheeler Sr.
How many other Benjamin Franklin Wheelers are there?
Two more.
Two.
My father and me.
Okay. So how did the Wheelers get here? I mean, the Lawtons got here after the Civil War. Where did B.F. Wheeler Sr. come from?
Well, John Thomas, who was B.F. Sr.'s father, came here after the Civil War, and he claimed a homestead and sawed all the timber off of it. And once the timber was gone, he let it go back, and that's when he moved to Dade City.
Well, the timber was always a big, particularly pine timber, was always important in Oviedo. What did they do with the pine? Cut it up, saw it up? What do you do?
It was used mostly for lumber. The first thing they did was chip it for turpentine. And once the trees had given up all their turpentine, then they would cut them and make lumber out of them.
Were there a lot of sawmills? I read one place where there were 5 sawmills in the area.
I couldn't swear to the number, but there were several.
In order to slice those into planks for housing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, Wheeler set up a business. Who did he set up a business with? What business did he get into?
Well, his father died when he was 11, and he had a younger brother and a mother to support. And R.W. Lawton brought him back here. And he just took any kind of work he could get. One of the things he said he did was hoe orange trees. There was a big grove out there where Winter Springs High School is now. And he said he would walk out there, hoe trees all day, and walk back for a penny apiece. And there was the coastline, the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, had a depot agent here named Mr. Crutchfield. And he and my granddad took a shine to each other. And he let him hang around the depot, and he taught him Morse code, let him help sweeping and whatever needed to be doing, and my grandfather ended up being the depot agent. when Mr. Crutchfield retired. Well, as depot agent, he made a princely sum of $15 a month, which really, a lot of people couldn't even get a job. But he got that, and that's when he endeavored to buy the property on South Lake Jessup, where the big brick house is.
Where the Evans Wheeler house.
Right. And he obliged to pay $5 a month on a mortgage. Well, he said there was a half a dozen old tangerine trees on the place. And he started taking care of them. And about the second year he was tending to them, they yielded 6 boxes, which a box is 2 bushels of tangerines. And he took them down to Nelson Brothers packing house and sold them and got $5 a box for them. Now that's like 6 months worth of mortgage payments. And he said that got his attention. And as time went by, Mr. Fred Nelson wanted to get out, and so my grandfather bought his portion of Nelson Brothers. And later Mr. Steen Nelson wanted to get out, so he bought his portion, and then he named it Nelson and Company.
But actually it was Wheeler who owned it. Why didn't he change the name to Wheeler?
Because the brands they had were already established, and he didn't want to start over.
So everybody up north that this was the fruit was shipped to
Right.
knew that name Nelson.
The brand name was White Rose.
When there was a White Rose label,
Mm-hmm.
you knew it came from a good place. Well, what business did your grandfather get into if he owned the citrus packing house, Nelson and Company? What else did he do?
He was a real forward-thinking man, and he saw opportunity where a lot of people didn't. He was instrumental in getting Oviedo incorporated as a city. It was 1 square mile. But the relations with Sanford as the county seat were such that he didn't foresee Oviedo getting a fair shake out of the county. And so he got Oviedo incorporated. He was also on the county commission. He was the driving force behind the county buying what's now called what is it called? The 5 Points Complex. The original purpose of it was to have an indigent home and pauper cemetery. That grew into being an old folks home, and they raised all their own food. And then years later, the county began moving their facilities out there, the fire department and the courthouse and jail and animal control.
And sitting in the middle of all of that official administration is still what was the old folks' home.
Yes.
It's still there. It's never
Yes.
demolished.
It's now it's now the home of the Museum of Seminole County History.
One of the things about the citrus industry in Oviedo was the freezes that would happen regularly. How did people withstand the destroying of their crop, and sometimes even destruction of their trees?
Well, all of them didn't stand it. There was a disastrous freeze in December of '94 in February of '95. And it was destructive enough that a lot of people just gave up and moved. There's stories about houses with dishes still on the table and food in them, and they were just left. People just lost heart and left. But the few that remained eventually did come back. My grandfather being one, Mr. Lee, C.S. Lee being another one. And there's probably some names that I don't recall now.
What about the Clonces? Were they doing citrus at that time?
No, the Clonces came in 1924.
Well, when you have this packing, and Nelson and Company packed fruit
Mm-hmm.
in these crates to send north, how did you send them north? On the steamboats that originally plied the Lake Jessup, or how did they get them up north to New York?
I'm sure at some point they shipped them on a steamboat, but my recollection is the railroads.
And which railroads did?
Well, there were two that came to Lake Charm. There was the Atlantic Coast Line, and there was the Seaboard Airline. And they both had spurs that went down into Black Hammock to the Celery pre-coolers and wash houses. At one time, there was 2 trains a day, one on each railroad, out of Oviedo, of nothing but produce. Excuse me. There's a lot of confusion about the 2 railroads because they later merged and became Seaboard Coastline. And then it was incorporated into the family lines, and then it was Seaboard System, and then it became CSX, which is what it is now.
When did those trains stop running through Oviedo? Because there's no trains there now.
I'd say in the early 80s.
Why didn't we need the trains anymore?
Well, all the produce traffic had gone to trucks. The railroads were so contrary about the service that people got tired of it. And at that time, the northern railroads, the Pennsylvania, the B&O, those lines were having terrific union problems. And our stuff would get to Washington, D.C. and sit.
So Oviedo was in trouble. They couldn't get it to market.
Right. Right.
Well, there was another train in Oviedo, the Dinky Line.
That was the Seaboard.
Was part of the Seaboard.
Yes. It had previously been the Florida Central and Peninsular. And the tracks were so raggedy that they were forever and a day getting derailed. And the local folks nicknamed it the Friends Come and Push. But a lot of people think the whole system was the Dinky Line, and it was not.
Just the part that ran from Oviedo to Orlando.
Right.
Okay. How long did the Dinky Line last? That's not...
Well, it became part of the CSX, and so they all came up about the same time.
Why did we don't do and sell and pack citrus anymore in Oviedo? And it was the big money maker. What happened?
Because of the freezes and the greening virus.
Shut down the whole citrus
Shut
product.
down the whole thing. Statewide production is down 75% now.
You were talking about the trains would go to the packing houses. How were the packing houses run? Who did you just bring it in from the fields, and what do you do with it?
Bring the fruit in from the field? Yeah.
Just pluck it off the tree?
And picked it and put in boxes, those 2-bushel boxes. brought to the packing house, and then it was graded and washed and cleaned and packed by size into shipping containers. And those went on the railroad.
Just loaded them up on the railroad.
Mhm.
But, yeah, I'd heard about that, putting them in by size.
Mm-hmm.
If it was a bunch of tangerines, you could fit 120.
So many, depending on the size. And that was determined by the USDA. You had to have an inspector all the time. And the sizes were, on tangerines, they were 80s, 120s, 176s, 210, and 246.
Wow, they must have been small tangerines.
They were little bitty fellas.
But if you had a grapefruit,
Now, we didn't pack many grapefruit. I'm not real up on the sizes on them. I know there was a 40 and a 48. I think the other one was 72.
those are the small grapefruit. Get 72.
Oranges, round oranges, were 80s, 100s, 120s.
Did that mean that we had different varieties of oranges?
Oh, yeah, sure.
What varieties did we make? Did we grow?
Well, we had tangerines, dancing tangerines. Later, they developed the Orlando Tangelo. We had a world of them. And then there were the early oranges like the Hamlin and the Pineapple and the Parson Brown and the Valencian. But they all come off at different times.
That's nice. You don't have to pack them all at one time.
No, you can't pack them all at once.
Who did the work? Who worked in the packing house? Who picked the fruit?
Well, you had picking crews. You'd have a foreman and he'd go out and recruit help to pick the fruit. And then the packing house had their own crew that packed and graded and put crates together and everything that it takes to run the packing house.
Did they live in Oviedo?
Everybody did. Oviedo was never, until this latter date, a bedroom community. If you lived in Oviedo, it was because you worked in Oviedo.
Something to do with agriculture.
Unless you were a merchant or a preacher or something like that, yes.
But by the beginning of the 20th century, there was a shift from citrus to celery. Who brought celery to Oviedo, and why was Oviedo such a good place to grow celery?
Well, the first place it came to was Sanford. And at that time, they thought that you couldn't grow celery on muck. It had to be grown on sand, which that side of Lake Monroe there, where Sanford is, was ideally suited to that. And then the King brothers decided they were going to try it in Oviedo. We had some sand land, but we had more muck than we did sand. And so when they found out they could grow it on the muck, then it expanded rapidly then. And celery was a high dollar crop. Number one, it was considered kind of exotic. And number two, once the Depression hit, there was a tremendous demand for celery because they used it in soup kitchens. It was, it'll stretch anything that you put it with. Then, about the time the Depression was over, World War II came along, and for reasons that I've never understood, celery was not considered necessary for the war effort. And so they didn't impose any price ceilings on it. And the price of celery just went through the roof during those war years. And people made money just like going to town on a Saturday. In 1929, Seminole County's celery crop was worth about $15 million. Just the celery crop.
I'd heard we'd been called the celery capital of the world.
Well, we were. There was no Zellwood, there was no Everglades. The celery came from Seminole County.
Well, when you're growing celery, it sounds like celery is a rather delicate
It
crop
is,
to grow.
and it takes a lot of water to grow it. And we had the ample water supplies. We had the flowing wells to keep the fields wet, and it did well here.
And there were plenty of celery fields around Oviedo.
Oh yeah.
Well, when you put the celery out, I've heard that you have to put the celery out first in small plots. Then you pick them up and replant them.
Yes, you plant seed beds and raise the plants up until they're big enough to set out. And then you transplant them to the field.
And let them grow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how did they get enough water to handle?
They developed a system of subsurface irrigation, which simply put was rows of tile under the ground. And the tile was not cemented together, it was just joint to joint. And you turned the wells on, and anywhere that there was a joint, water would seep out.
Sort of like a drip line,
Yeah.
only large and underground.
And you could raise and lower the water level by a system of stops. At the end of each row, you had a concrete pocket and holes ever so often, and however high you wanted the water to go, you stopped off the holes. And of course, it would seek its own level.
Well, once your celery is grown in this muckland and you decide to harvest it, then what do you do with it?
You harvest it.
Yeah, you're going to harvest it, but you got to get it up north. How are you going to do it?
Well,
Get to market.
for many years it was cut by hand and put in boxes, and then it went to the celery wash house where it was washed and packed, and again there were sizes for it. And then they would put it through a pre-cooler bath to get it cold and pack it in box cars. And those box cars had bunkers, one in each end, and they loaded them with ice. And then they had a chipper there, and they would blow chipped ice all over the top of the celery. The car wouldn't hold it to the ceiling. There was about 3 feet from the top tier to the ceiling, and they'd blow that full of that chipped ice. And the cars had fans on them that ran by a belt drive, and that circulated the cool and kept them cool until they could get where they were going.
So the celery was crisp when it got there.
Yeah, it had to be.
Otherwise it'd be all wilted. If you take it out of the field and you stuff it in a crate and haul it north, it's going to be all wilted.
Oh no, they didn't do that.
You mentioned that there was a celery packing house out at Lake Charm, and then there was another celery packing house in Oviedo.
Mm-hmm.
So you had two of them operating at the same time. Is that because there was so much celery?
Yeah, and there was more than two. There were at least two more in Black Hammock. I'm not sure exactly. There might have been 3. But yes, there was well, how many pre-coolers would it take to make a train load of celery in it every day?
I don't know.
Well, just imagine.
How many cars would there be in a train? I mean, do they haul 100 cars or?
It depends on the time of the year, but the trains weren't near as big as they are now. They'd probably be 10 or 12.
You told me that you used to go over to the packing house yourself when you were a young man.
Yeah.
What was it like, and what were the trains like?
Well, the packing house was just about the nerve center of town. If you were looking for somebody, you'd meet them at the packing house, because there was always somebody there. And we didn't have, city hall and police department, fire department, and townhouse restaurant and all of that. You went to the packing house. You'd buy you a soda and sit down there with a package of Lance crackers and wait for them to come if they wasn't already there.
And so they'd come and load the train. The packers would load the train. Everybody else is sort of sitting and coming and going and socializing.
But it was the same when the packing house wasn't running. It was a meeting place.
Well, what about the trains themselves? Were they modern and useful?
Well, they weren't modern like what we have now. Like I said, they had fans and belt drives for refrigeration.
And you told me that the trains were, the tracks on the trains weren't that good.
They weren't. One of the big obstacles to settling this area was wet, low ground. And the tracks, if you see the route of either one of those railroads, they snake like this because they go from one high spot to the next to stay out of that muck. And they put the ties down on the bare sand. They didn't have any ballast or anything. And the rail was light. And so the trains were slow. They did oftentimes get on the ground, but that's all there was.
When the trains would get on the ground or derail like that, what do? I mean, everything stops?
Until they get it back on the rail. Back then, they didn't have cranes, and the railroad had some wreckers, but they were too heavy to come out there on that light track. So it was a matter of a gang of big, strong men and jacks and wooden blocks to jack that wheel up, and then the locomotive would pull it just enough to get it guided back over on the track.
So the boxcars had to be lifted up, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then placed back on the track.
Yeah. And oftentimes there would be places that were missing spikes and things like that. They'd have to nail it back down so it wouldn't roll again. It was a case of the rails rolling over is what derailed them.
No wonder the trains stopped coming.
Well, that is an ironic story. From the time the rails were laid in the 1880s until about 1980, those rails were the same rails that they put down originally. And rail is measured by the weight of a 3-foot section. And those light rails were, some of them were 60 pound and some of them were 70 pound for 3 feet. And after all of that time, they decided to relay the rails, and they put 100-pound rail all the way from Sanford to Oviedo. Now the seaboard had done theirs earlier, but this was the Atlantic coastline. And we found out later the government gave them a grant to upgrade this line, and then like 2 or 3 years later they got approval to abandon it, and they took all that up and took it and moved it, used it somewhere else.
So the whole rail line from Oviedo to Sanford
Yeah,
was torn up.
yeah.
When we talk about Oviedo and we talk about Seminole County, neither of them used to exist. You were mentioning was it your grandfather who helped get Oviedo incorporated as a town? Where did Seminole County come from? Because it wasn't originally Seminole County.
Well, you have to understand that because of the citrus and the celery and the other farming, Sanford swung a pretty big stick at that time. And they had tried 2 different times with a referendum to move the county seat from Orlando to Sanford, and failed. And Sanford, the people in Sanford thought that the world emanated from Sanford. They were conceited and I don't know what else to call it.
Arrogant.
They thought, yeah, arrogant. And Sanford was supposed to be it. And it was it as long as things were coming by the steamboat, because that was as far as they could come. But when the railroads came, that changed. And then along came Colonel Henry Sanford. And he was determined he was going to make Sanford something. And in about 1875, there was an infamous murder trial in Orange County that was coming up between the carpetbaggers and the locals. The carpetbaggers had imposed a head tax on cattle. And this is right after the Civil War now. And of course, the carpetbagger was in power. They were the sheriff and all of that. And he sent out some men to the outlying areas to collect that cattle tax. Well, they took the sheriff, tied him to an old bottom plow, and dropped him in Lake Kissimmee.
So the sheriff's now dead. Murdered.
Sheriff's dead, and there's this murder trial coming up of who supposedly did that. And all of a sudden, the courthouse burned down.
Now, is this the courthouse in Sanford or the courthouse in
No,
Orlando?
in Orlando. There wasn't no courthouse in Sanford.
Oh, but now it's burned down.
And it burned down on the eve of this trial. Well, whatever evidence they had, of course, was gone with it. So the question arose as to building a new courthouse. And Henry Sanford went to Orlando to the Board of County Commissioners and proposed that the courthouse be built in Sanford, inferring that that's where it should have been all the time. And he would give land for the courthouse. provided, of course, it was built in Sanford. Well, Mr. Jacob Summerlin, who was a leading citizen there, stood up and said, well, people are used to doing business in Orlando, and I think they ought to continue to do business in Orlando. And I'm going to loan the county $10,000 to build a courthouse, and they can pay me back or not. Well, of course, that dashed the hopes of who wouldn't in that day and time turn down that kind of money for a courthouse. Well, that was the second time. No, that was the third time they had been thwarted. There were 2 referendums before that that didn't garner enough support. So the courthouse was built in Orlando. And not to be outdone, Sanford formed a Divide the County committee. And there were 6 or 8 of the real prominent citizens in Sanford that spearheaded it. And they elected Forest Lake as the representative for Orange County.
To the state legislature.
To the state legislature. And in 1913, he had gathered enough support that he put a bill through to create Seminole County. And according to the record, it passed way in the middle of the night on almost the last day of the session. And he rushed it over to the governor for signature before anybody could catch on to what was happening. And that became Seminole County. Well, Orange County was fit to be tied because he was their representative too. But he didn't let any of them know what he was doing. So that's how Seminole County got here.
So we became our own county because we were a piece of Orange, and then we tricked them into letting us into having our own county.
And in the effort to get that done, there was a group of citizens in Oviedo, including a former Orange County commissioner, who did not think it was a good idea and didn't support it. And when the thing passed, the new commissioners set out to exact retribution from all the outlying areas that didn't support it.
Uh-oh.
And that's why we had the kind of roads and schools we had. Because they didn't get any money.
So they strangled Oviedo,
Yeah.
in effect, from
Yeah.
all the county money
Yeah.
for improvement.
Oviedo, Chiliota, Geneva.
They didn't get any road money,
Oh.
school money.
And that did not change until the Supreme Court got into the segregation issue and took the funding authority away from the county commission and the school board and mandated that they had to make a level playing field. And that was in the late 60s.
Well, Oviedo was a pretty small town, well into the 70s. I mean, 800 people, maybe 1,000, small town.
It was about 2,500.
By the time we get to late 70s.
Right. It was 1 square mile on the map.
We didn't even have a police department or a fire department.
We had a volunteer fire department and we had 1 policeman. And he was also the constable for the unincorporated areas, he was empowered to enforce the law.
So what we call today's sheriff. He would have been a deputy sheriff for this area.
Probably, yes.
But now we don't use the term constable anymore.
No, they've outlawed that office.
Who is the constable? Who is this?
George Kelsey.
He's pretty much of a legend in Oviedo.
Yeah, he served for a long time. And he was also the city police.
Did he do a good job?
He knew what was going on.
He knew what was happening
Yeah,
in everybody's family and everybody.
yeah. He had eyes and ears everywhere.
He was a character. Are there any other important people in Oviedo that ought to be mentioned? Any other eccentric characters?
Well, there was a few of them that were kind of humorous, but none to the extent that George was. Mr. T.L. Lingo had an insurance agency in the back of that building that they just tore down on Broadway Street, what used to be the drugstore. And he would send his bird dog across the street to the post office to get his mail. And they'd tie it up and put it in the dog's mouth, and he'd bring it back over there to him. And he'd send a note down to the grocery store in the middle of the block for a pound of steak or hamburger or whatever. They'd wrap it up and give it to the dog. The dog would bring it right on back there to him.
Didn't eat the steak?
No. No.
Well, you're a Lawton, way back a Lawton. What about the Lawton family? You're related to them a couple of generations ago.
Yeah. Well, Professor Lawton, T.W. Lawton, for whom the school is named, was probably the first person to get a college education in Oviedo. And he rode the dinky back and forth every day to get to school at Rollins. Now, I don't know whether he bummed or if he bought a ticket, but that's how he got there. He became, I think, the second superintendent of schools for the county.
Yeah, the first elected one. The first one was appointed by the governor
Right.
when we finally became the
Right.
county.
And he served until about 1953, so it was 30-some years. When he got ready to retire, somebody figured out that if each child in the county would give a penny, they'd have enough to buy him a new car. And so they all put their pennies in and bought him a brand new Chevrolet sedan when he retired.
Appreciated gift.
I'm sure.
Where did the people in town go to church? Because I've always heard that the churches were very important in Oviedo.
If the churches were behind it, it would happen. Well, there's two things that any little small town has a plethora of, and that's churches and gas stations. They might not have a grocery store, they might not have a doctor, but they'd have churches and gas stations. There was the First Baptist of Oviedo, the First Methodist of Oviedo. Then there was Church of God.
And of course the black churches.
I'm trying to think of the name of the one on Mission Road Baptist Church, Antioch, Fountainhead. There were two more down in Lawtonville, but I can't think of the names of either one of them. One of them's still operating. But church was a big factor in what went on in town.
Did the Methodists and the Baptists cooperate? I mean, they were fairly
Yeah.
close together.
Yeah. The early days they had service every other Sunday. And whatever Sunday it was at the Methodist church, everybody went there. Then the next week they'd go to the Baptist church.
Well, to get on a bit of a lighter side, when it comes around Halloween, we always hear talk about the spooky Oviedo Lights.
Yeah.
We're famous for having the spooky Oviedo Lights. What were they, or are they, if they still exist?
There are, they still exist, but the reality of them has been blown way out of proportion. Back then, if you went down there to the bridge on a bright moonlit night, you could see a sparkle in the water, and it was phosphorus. And that became, it was just a curiosity to go and see, and of course that bridge is way out beyond anywhere, and the kids like to go there. But then it got to be the Oviedo Lights. And if we went to Winter Park or Sanford, we'd hear the kids talking about the Oviedo Lights. And oh, there was this ball of fire coming down the road, and there was somebody hung in the water tower.
Was that true? Somebody hung in the water?
No, none of that was true. None of that was true. But you couldn't convince anybody that I'd say there was more chemical enhancement that went on than anything else.
Oh, okay. Since you are so knowledgeable, lived in Oviedo and your family lived there, is there anything else that's unique or special about Oviedo that you remember?
Well, it's kind of lost this now since we're not a bedroom community anymore. But there was a community that engulfed everybody. And there were any number of things that were citizen initiated that we would have never had otherwise. The swimming pool for one. The memorial building for another. The doctor's clinic for another. The Woman's Club started the first garbage collection. The Woman's Club funded the first, I don't know what you'd call it now, we call it a rescue wagon. You know, a van with oxygen and first responder kind of thing.
Because there was no EMTs.
No.
So-
The firemen manned it. You were asking me a while ago about how do you report a fire. Well, there was a big whistle up on a pole by the firehouse, and you went there and pushed the button, and you could hear it all over town. And people would come, the men would come, and they'd tell them where the fire was, and they'd go to it. It usually amounted to saving the house next to the house that was on fire. Because a lot of those houses were tar paper and wood and all, and they just went up like a box of matches.
So did you just come like the old-fashioned thing, come out and pump the pump and spray the water on the house next
Not
door?
quite that primitive. In 1947, the city bought a Ford truck. It was the first one they could get after the war. And the young returning veterans built a tank, a water tank, on it and put a pump on it. And that was the first fire truck. And then in 1957, the city bought another commercial grade fire truck. So we had two. But it wasn't uncommon at all for the fire whistle to blow and somebody rushed down there who didn't know where the fire was and didn't know how to operate the pump. And they'd get in the fire truck and go dashing off somewhere. Somebody'd have to catch them and bring them back.
They couldn't pick up the microphone and say, "Dispatch, where are we going?"
No, it wasn't any of that. Now, George Kelsey did have a radio connected to the sheriff's department, but that was it.
Well, I was trying to think if there was anything else. It is interesting that Oviedo was so close-knit that they did the swimming pool, the memorial building in memoriam to the Second World War people, and the canning kitchen,
that was
community canning kitchen.
A thing from the war effort. But that memorial building and the clinic, both, were built with as much donated labor and materials as there was, probably more than what was purchased. Dudas gave the lumber. Bob Ash was a brick mason. He laid all the block. Joe Linehart had lumber that he had cut in Black Hammock years ago. He furnished all the trim and the woodwork for the inside of the building and probably put it up, knowing him. It was a concerted effort because Dr. Martin had retired and he had to move to Orlando in order to retire because people wouldn't quit coming. His office was right beside his house up there where the Baptist church is now. And people just wouldn't take no for an answer. And so finally he moved. And that was another thing my grandfather was a instigator in. He called together the leading businessmen in town and they said the only way we're ever going to get a doctor is to build a place for him to practice. And so mostly the major farmers in the area went together and raised some money and then set the volunteers to work.
And they built the clinic. Yeah, because the farmers at that time would have been the leading lights of the community.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Because they were the ones bringing in the income.
Mm-hmm.
How did the African American community and the white community get along with each other?
I don't ever remember any discord of any kind except for that one incident at the high school. And that was quickly put to rest, and we all just got along.
I heard a story once from a man who said that Benjamin Wheeler bought him a car because he didn't have the money and he needed it because he was the crew chief and he needed to get the guys to work. Do you remember that story?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was Buster Garrison. And he was an entrepreneur. He hauled his crew to the Grove and then he'd put sides on his truck and load it with oranges and haul them to the juice plant. And of course the old trucks were always something wrong with them. And he finally went to my dad and said, "Mr. Frank, I need me a new truck. And I ain't got no money. And I don't want you to tell me no."
And what did Frank Wheeler say?
He got him a truck. I don't know what the arrangements were. I'm sure he paid some on it. But Buster was a hugely industrious person to work night and day, do anything you want him to do, gladly. And my dad just saw the worth of it. He sent him over to Holler Chevrolet, and I'm sure he called Mr. Holler and said, get this man a truck. That's the way things worked back then. Years later, I had a mirror get knocked off of my Chevrolet truck, one of the outside mirrors. And I went to the place to get it seen about. And I was in my work clothes, and I had my little dog with me, and the only thing I had for a leash was a piece of hay baling twine about so long. So I made a leash out of that, and me and her were walking around outside, and the service writer said, well, I don't know if we got the part, and I don't know if we got time to put it on, and all this, that, and the other. I said, I'll wait, because this was in Winter Park now. And there was, I'll never forget this, there was a salesman. He had rose-colored glasses and a pink ultra suede coat on. And he came out there to smoke a cigarette and took one look at me and my dog and wheeled around and went back inside. And so help me, it wasn't a minute or two. Mr. Holler came out, and he walked over there to me, and we shook hands and started talking, you know, just passing the time. And all of a sudden, that service writer came out there and said, Mr. Wheeler, we're going to get you taken care of.
You looked like you didn't have two nickels to rub together, and he didn't know who he was dealing with.
That's what they thought.
And you were one of the most important families in town.
Can't judge a book by its cover. I guess the one story I would tell again, because it's so funny to me, our county commissioner in this district was B.C. Dodd. He lived out there in Goldenrod. And at that time, the commissioner got to say where the road money was spent in his district. Well, I want so-and-so fixed, or, you know, whatever. So Mr. Dodd stood up and he said, I want to pave that road from the city limits of Oviedo to the county line, which is now Alafaya Trail. It was just dirt before that. And the commissioner from Sanford jumped up and says, I don't know why you want to do that. Said, ain't nobody ever going to use it. And he said, you hush, Pope. I didn't say anything about what you did in your district, and this is what I want to do. And how prophetic that decision turned out to be. Because where Mitchell Hammock Road crosses Alafaya was the city limits. And from there on out this way it was dirt, clay.
And he was the only one that was farsighted enough to see you're going to need her.
That was in the early 60s. We had heard about what was going to be the new space university, but nothing had actually happened.
Yeah, because they hadn't chosen the site yet.
Right.
Boy, he was taking a gamble.
Yeah, he was.
Maybe that's why Dodd Road is named after him.
Well, he was a prominent figure, and he was huge. He was like 7 foot something tall. They got one of his shoes in the Goldenrod Museum, and I'm not kidding you, it's like that. He was a giant. And of course that went along with his demeanor. At that time, they were trying to decide where to put FTU. And one of the sites they looked at was where Seminole Community College is. And another site they looked at was there across from Lockwood Road and 419. And Mr. C.S. Lee offered to give them the land if they'd put it there. But Mr. Billy Dial in Orlando and a few more like that, they wasn't going to have that. So FTU got put where it is, and as a consolation prize, we got the Iron Bridge sewer plant and Seminole College. And where they are is no accident. There was still some animosity there.
So we're here at UCF, and it's out of the farsightedness of Mr. Dodd.
Well,
We got a way to get here.
He played a role in it.
Well, is there anything else that you would like to add about Oviedo? Something that you really appreciate about living in that town, growing up in that town?
The people. I had so many good friends, and a lot of people worked for my dad, and of course I got to know them, and I miss them tremendously. And I miss that sense of community.
The whole downtown is gone now.
Old downtown is gone, but what's really gone is that fellowship. If you needed something that somebody in the community that was their forte, you just went to them and said, I need a well put out, I need a survey made, I need, whatever it was. And they all worked together. I wrote a column for The Voice one time about they all worked together, and I can't find it anymore, but I named a couple of dozen things that happened that way in Oviedo.
Somebody needed their fellow man.
Well, we need a clinic. We need a city hall. We need a swimming pool. We need garbage service. There was just a lot of things and they would have never happened any other way because we weren't going to get any support from the county, and the city didn't have any money.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ben, for talking to us, and letting us know
My
about
pleasure.
Oviedo. Yeah, you're a fount of knowledge.
I'll probably go home and say, dang, why didn't I tell them that?
I'm sure you will.